This is the definitive bombing arsenal of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army. From the canvas biplanes of the 1930s to the experimental jet bombers of 1945, a complete catalog of 25 Japanese bomber aircraft used in World War II. Let's begin. The sword of the fleet, the carrier-based strike aircraft. Nakajima B-5N, the Kate, the torpedo bomber of Pearl Harbor. Obsolete by Western standards, but flown by the world's best crews, it was a devastating weapon. On December 7, 1941, Kates sank the battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia. They used specially modified torpedoes with wooden fins that could run in shallow water, something the Americans thought was impossible. It remained deadly for 2 years until Japan's best pilots were gone. Nakajima B-6N Tenzan, the Jill, the powerful successor to the Kate, fast and heavily armed for a torpedo bomber. It had everything the Kate lacked, a stronger engine, better armor, and a bigger bomb load. But it arrived too late. By 1943, most of Japan's skilled carrier pilots were already dead. The Jill fought in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, the last time Japanese carriers launched a major attack. Aichi D-3A, the Val, a carrier-based dive bomber with fixed landing gear. It sank more Allied warships than any other Axis aircraft in the entire war. The Val crippled British carriers, destroyed cruisers, and hit targets from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. It had an incredibly stable dive that let pilots aim with deadly accuracy. Japanese pilots trained by dropping bombs into floating barrels. Even though it was slow and easy to shoot down, in skilled hands it was terrifying. Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei, the Judy, a fast liquid-cooled dive bomber designed to outrun fighters after dropping its payload. Built for pure speed, it could hit over 350 miles per hour. That made it one of the fastest dive bombers of the war, fast enough to escape if the pilot was good. It was also used for reconnaissance because nothing could catch it. During the final battles at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, many Judys were used in kamikaze attacks. Aichi B-7A Ryusei, the Grace, a hybrid weapon. Large and powerful, it could act as both a dive bomber and a torpedo bomber. It had internal bomb bays, heavy guns, and long range. The Grace was designed to replace both the Kate and the Val with one superior aircraft. Fast, deadly, and well-built. But it arrived far too late. By 1944, Japan had lost most of its carriers. These impressive machines sat on land bases, and many ended their lives in kamikaze missions. Only around 100 were ever built. Yokosuka PYY Ginga, the Francis, a sleek twin-engine land-based bomber. It was fast enough to be used as a night fighter. The Francis could outrun many Allied fighters, which gave it a real chance of survival. Some were converted into night fighters with upward-firing cannons to hunt B-29s in the dark. Others became kamikaze aircraft in the final year. The Francis showed what Japan could build when they focused on speed and performance, but unreliable engines and collapsing factories meant it never reached its potential. The long-range hammers, the Navy's land-based bombers. Mitsubishi G4M, the Betty, the flying cigar, famous for its incredible range, but notorious for its unprotected fuel tanks that made it explode when hit. The Betty could fly over 3,000 miles without refueling, farther than almost any other bomber in the world. This let Japanese forces strike targets the enemy thought were safe, but that range came at a terrible cost. To save weight, the designers didn't armor the fuel tanks. One tracer bullet could turn the entire plane into a fireball. American pilots called them flying lighters because they went up in flames so easily. Despite this fatal flaw, the Betty served throughout the entire war and was used in every major campaign. Mitsubishi G3M, the Nell, the predecessor to the Betty, famous for sinking the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse in 1941. That attack shocked the world. It was the first time aircraft alone sank modern battleships that were underway and fighting back. The Nell proved that the age of the battleship was over. Like the Betty, it had amazing range but weak defenses. It was a pre-war design with thin skin and no armor. By 1942, it was already outdated, but Japan kept using it because they didn't have enough replacements. Many Nells ended their service as transport aircraft or training planes. Nakajima G8N, Renzan, the Rita, a massive four-engine heavy bomber intended to bomb the U.S. mainland. This was Japan's attempt to build their own B-29. The Rita was huge, heavily armed with cannons in multiple turrets, and designed to fly across the Pacific Ocean to strike American cities. It represented Japan's desperation to hit back at the American homeland. But it never happened. The first prototype didn't fly until 1944, when Japan was already losing the war badly. The engines were unreliable, and Japanese factories couldn't produce them in large numbers. Only 4 were ever built. None saw combat. Tachikawa Ki-74, the Patsy, a pressurized, long-range, high-altitude bomber designed to strike targets as far away as India. The Patsy was built to fly higher than enemy fighters could reach, over 30,000 feet. It had a pressurized cabin so the crew could breathe at that altitude. The range was incredible, designed to hit British bases in India and Ceylon from Japanese airfields in Southeast Asia. But like so many Japanese designs, it arrived too late and in too few numbers. Development problems delayed it, and by the time it was ready, Japan was on the defensive. Most were destroyed on the ground by American air raids.
Yokosuka P-1Y Jinga, the Francis. Already mentioned in carrier aircraft, but it deserves another look as a land-based bomber. Originally designed as a fast, medium bomber for the Navy, the Francis was one of Japan's best attempts at a modern bomber. Twin engines, good speed, decent bomb load. Some versions carried torpedoes for attacking ships. Others were fitted with radar and cannons to hunt bombers at night. The problem was the engines. They constantly overheated and caught fire. Mechanics struggled to keep them running. Many Francis never made it to their targets because the engines failed halfway there. In the final months, reliable ones were packed with explosives for one-way kamikaze missions. The Army's workhorses, the medium and heavy bombers of the Japanese Army. Mitsubishi Ki-21, the Sally. The Army's heavy bomber workhorse, it saw action in every theater of the Asian War, from the jungles of Burma to the frozen battlefields of Manchuria. The Sally was everywhere. It bombed Chinese cities, supported ground troops in the Philippines, and attacked Allied airfields across Southeast Asia. When the war started, it was considered a modern bomber with good range and a decent bomb load. But by 1942, it was already struggling. American and British fighters were faster and better armed. The Sally's defensive guns couldn't keep them away. Still, Japan had no choice but to keep using them. Hundreds were shot down, but hundreds more kept flying because the Army had nothing better in large numbers. Mitsubishi Ki-67, Hiryu, the Peggy, the best Japanese bomber of the war. Fast, maneuverable enough to loop, and heavily armored, the Peggy was what Japan should have been building from the start. It could hit 334 miles per hour, faster than many fighters. It had armor protecting the crew and self-sealing fuel tanks that didn't explode when hit. The Peggy could even dogfight if it had to. Pilots reported it handled more like a fighter than a bomber. It was used for everything: conventional bombing, torpedo attacks against ships, and even kamikaze missions. If Japan had built thousands of these instead of the vulnerable Betty and Sally, the air war might have gone differently. But it only entered service in 1944, far too late to change anything. Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu, the Helen, designed as a heavy bomber escort, but it was underpowered and failed in its role. The Helen was supposed to protect other bombers by flying alongside them with heavy guns. The idea was good, but the execution was terrible. The engines weren't powerful enough for the weight of all that armor and ammunition. It was slow, couldn't climb well, and couldn't keep up with the bombers it was supposed to protect. Even worse, it couldn't carry many bombs because of the weight problem. The Helen became a bomber that couldn't bomb effectively, and an escort that couldn't escort. Most ended up doing transport duties or were converted into kamikaze aircraft. Kawasaki Ki-48, the Lily, a light bomber widely used in China and the Philippines. Fast, but carried a small bomb load. The Lily was built for speed over payload. It could outrun many Chinese fighters, which made it useful in the early war. But against modern Allied fighters, speed alone wasn't enough. It couldn't carry enough bombs to do serious damage, and it couldn't defend itself well. The light armor meant it went down easily when hit. Despite these weaknesses, the Army used it heavily in China, where the opposition was weaker. By 1943, most Lilies were being used for training or suicide attacks. Mitsubishi Ki-30, the An, an early light bomber with fixed landing gear used extensively in the early conquests. The An was already old-fashioned when the war started. Those fixed wheels hanging down created drag and made it slow. But in China and during the invasion of Southeast Asia, it didn't matter much. The opposition was weak. The An could drop its bombs and get home safely. It was reliable and easy to fly, which made it popular with pilots. But when it faced modern fighters and anti-aircraft guns, the An was slaughtered. By 1942, it was pulled from frontline service and used for training new pilots. Kawasaki Ki-32, the Mary, the liquid-cooled light bomber that struggled in tropical heat. In the ground attack role, the Mary faced even worse problems. Flying low and slow made it an easy target, and one bullet through that liquid cooling system meant the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. Pilots hated taking it into heavy combat because they knew any hit could be fatal. The Mary was quickly retired from frontline ground attack duties and replaced by more survivable aircraft. Most that survived were used for reconnaissance or training far from the fighting. The Army learned an expensive lesson. Fancy engines don't matter if the basic design is outdated. The Close Support Fleet, light bombers and ground attack aircraft. Mitsubishi Ki-51, the Sonia, a ground attack aircraft, slow but rugged and maneuverable, perfect for jungle warfare. The Sonia wasn't built to fly fast or high. It was built to fly low and slow over battlefields, supporting soldiers on the ground. It had fixed landing gear like an old biplane, but that didn't matter for its job. The Sonia could turn tight, dive steep, and take battle damage without falling apart. In the jungles of Burma and New Guinea, it attacked enemy positions with small bombs and machine guns. The thick jungle canopy meant it had to fly dangerously low to see targets. Many were shot down by ground fire, but the ones that survived kept coming back. Pilots loved it because it was forgiving and reliable. By 1944, most were used for kamikaze attacks. Kawasaki Ki-48, the Lily, fast but carried a small bomb load. Already covered in the Army bombers section, but worth mentioning again for its ground attack role. The Lily was too fast to be effective at close air support. It had to slow down to aim at small targets, and when it slowed down, it became vulnerable. The small bomb load meant it couldn't do much damage even when it hit. Against dug-in positions or armored vehicles, it was nearly useless. The Army kept trying to make it work, adding different guns and bomb racks, but nothing helped. Speed without hitting power is just wasted fuel. Kawasaki Ki-32, the Mary, the liquid-cooled light bomber that struggled in tropical heat. In the ground attack role, the Mary faced even worse problems. Fly low and slow made it an easy target, and one bullet through that liquid cooling system meant the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. Pilots hated taking it into heavy combat because they knew any hit could be fatal. The Mary was quickly retired from frontline ground attack duties and replaced by more survivable aircraft. Most that survived were used for reconnaissance or training far from the fighting. The Army learned an expensive lesson. Fancy engines don't matter if the basic design is outdated. The Desperate End, Special Attack and Experimental Bombers. Yokosuka MYX-7 Oka, the Baka, a rocket-powered, human-guided suicide missile dropped from a bomber. This wasn't really an aircraft. It was a flying bomb with a man inside. The Baka had no landing gear, no way to turn back, and barely enough fuel for one attack run. A Betty bomber would carry it underneath, fly close to the enemy fleet, and release it. Then, the pilot would ignite the rocket engines and dive at over 600 miles per hour into a ship. The Americans called it Baka, which means fool in Japanese. It was incredibly fast in the final dive, too fast for guns to track. But getting close enough to launch was almost impossible. American fighters learned to shoot down the slow, heavy Betty bombers before they could release their deadly cargo. Hundreds of Bakas were built. Most never reached a target. Nakajima Kika, Japan's first jet bomber. heavily influenced by the German Me-262. The Kikka looked almost identical to the German jet, and that's no accident. Japan got blueprints from Germany late in the war and rushed to copy the design. It had 2 jet engines under the wings and was designed as a fast attack bomber. The prototype flew in August 1945, just days before Japan surrendered. It never saw combat. Only 2 were completed before the war ended. The Kikka represented what Japan could have built if they had started earlier, but by 1945, it was far too late. Japan lacked the materials, the fuel, and the time to produce jet aircraft in meaningful numbers. Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi, the Sabre, a cheaply made plane with a wooden stick for a throttle, designed solely for one-way missions. This was desperation in physical form. The Tsurugi had no landing gear, minimal instruments, and non-retractable landing gear that was meant to fall off after takeoff to save weight. The controls were crude. The throttle was literally a wooden stick. It carried 1 large bomb and enough fuel to reach the target, but not return. The idea was to build them fast and cheap using unskilled labor and non-strategic materials. Train a pilot for just a few hours, point him at an American ship, and hope he hits something. Over 100 were built, but the war ended before they were used. Many crashed during test flights because they were so poorly built. Yokosuka MY-X8 Akigusa, an experimental rocket-powered kamikaze glider. Even more primitive than the Baka, the Akigusa was essentially a rocket strapped to a glider filled with explosives. It would be towed into the air by another aircraft, released near the target, fire its rockets for a final boost of speed, and crash into enemy ships. No complicated engines to maintain, no fuel tanks to protect, just wood, metal, explosives, and a rocket motor.
It never left the testing phase. Japan surrendered before production began, but the fact that engineers were the legacy. 25 bomber aircraft that told the story of an empire's ambition and desperation, from the Pearl Harbor Kates that shocked the world to the Baka suicide missiles of the final days. From the elegant Grace that arrived too late to the crude Tsurugi built from scrap wood and desperation. This fleet represents both the pinnacle of Japanese aviation engineering and the darkest chapters of the war. Aircraft that began as tools of conquest ended as weapons of last resort, flown by inexperienced boys on one-way missions. The bombers that once ranged freely across the Pacific were eventually reduced to flying targets, overwhelmed by superior numbers, technology, and industrial might. Which bomber do you think had the greatest impact on the Pacific War? Let me know in the comments.